Hello, a very good morning to you. You're watching Sky News Breakfast, and we start in the United States, where Elon Musk has completed his £38 billion takeover of Twitter after months of going back and forth over the deal. In an immediate shake-up of the social media giant's top brass, Musk has already fired the platform's chief executive and finance boss. It's claimed they were escorted from the platform's headquarters in San Francisco. From there, our US correspondent Martha Kellner reports.
The world's richest man has been on a charm offensive inside Twitter HQ. Meeting a lot of cool people, he said, having coffee with staff. But any idea that this deal would be drama-free was shattered within hours when Elon Musk sacked 3 top executives. Musk's takeover hadn't even been officially announced when Twitter's chief executive, chief financial officer and head of legal affairs were shuttled from this building and told not to return. It is a power move and a sign of just how fundamentally he plans to change things here. He says he wants to make Twitter the world's digital town square. "I didn't do it because it would be easy," he tweeted. "I didn't do it to make more money. I did it to try and help humanity, whom I love." Musk has also hinted he will open Twitter back up to the former President Donald Trump. Some fear the billionaire will reduce content moderation on Twitter when abuse is still rife. But he isn't short of fans in his new neighbourhood.
I think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Really?
Yeah, huge fan of him. I think he'll do great things. It's long overdue.
I think he'll get Twitter in China, and that's a big market. He's had a lot of success in China with Tesla.
Musk himself says he overpaid for Twitter at $44 billion, but believes he can bring half the world onto his website. Elon Musk seems to be focusing on the idea of making Twitter more free speech, in his words. What do you make of that?
I thought it was really interesting that one of his first messages was to the advertisers of Twitter, and to say kind of, don't worry too much, because if it becomes this cesspool of kind of hate and other undesirable content, advertisers are going to go away. So I think he said some of those things, but he's going to confront the reality of trying to attract more advertisers.
This takeover completes a 7-month-long will he, won't he saga. Even by Musk's mercurial standards, it's been perplexing. What happens next, though, is even harder to predict.
And Martha has the latest now from San Francisco.
We're expecting Elon Musk to return to the headquarters of Twitter here in downtown San Francisco tomorrow to address staff in a town hall-style meeting where he'll hear their queries, perhaps even their concerns about the future direction of this organisation under his guidance. And it will be interesting to hear what sort of a response Elon Musk receives, particularly in the wake of him getting rid of some of those major lieutenants in this organisation. And I've seen staff this evening, Twitter staff, outside the headquarters in tears. So there are clearly major changes afoot. And it's important to note that this has been a long time coming. Elon Musk first made an unsolicited bid for Twitter back in April. He's been dropping crumbs of information since then on what he expects Twitter to look like under his control. Less moderation, he's been suggesting, of what users are allowed to put on the platform. But he did tweet this week, Twitter obviously cannot become a free-for-all hellscape where anything can be said with no consequences. There are major elections on the horizon, both here in the USA, the midterm elections coming up, also a presidential election in Brazil on the horizon. Both those events are likely to be plagued by misinformation and election denial. So this will be a first real test of what Elon Musk allows to be put on his platform. It's a first major test. We'll find out very soon where exactly his red lines are.
Martha Kellner there. Well, I'm now joined by the Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey. Very good morning to you, Therese Coffey. Lots to talk about this morning. But first of all, I wonder what your reaction is to Elon Musk completing his takeover of Twitter. Is that something to be welcomed, do you think?
Well, it was certainly a big move by Elon Musk, much trailed and started to negotiate early in the year. But I think it's significant he's decided to invest in this social media site. although admittedly as a politician at times it feels like an anti-social media site. But it's an important way of how people communicate around the world, and we'll see what the next steps are.
Well, yes, he has called himself a free speech absolutist. He's been critical of Twitter's moderation policies. Some people are concerned that relaxing moderation policies could mean that hate speech would be allowed to proliferate. Is that something that worries you?
Well, I think that would be concerning, and it's important that people who have these platforms use them responsibly rather than to promulgate hate. But it's also important to have safety, which is another reason why we're bringing back or carrying on with the online safety bill in Parliament next week.
Donald Trump, US President, former, of course, still banned from the platform at the moment. Elon Musk in the past has described that as foolish. Would you like to see Donald Trump back on Twitter?
I have no view on Donald Trump being on Twitter at all. Candidly, that's going to be a matter for Twitter.
OK, well, let's move on to other issues. You're now Secretary of State for the Environment, as of this week, of course. Why is Rishi Sunak not attending COP27?
Well, I've been to 3 COPs in the past, and the UK hands over the presidency. Alex Sharma will do that on the very first day of COP. But I think it's normally the case that every 5 years the big political COPs happen, and that's when you see, as we saw in Glasgow last year, all the different heads of state and prime ministers coming from around the world. In between, they tend to be more detailed discussions, but other senior ministers, including myself, will be going to Egypt, to Sharm el-Sheikh, for different aspects where we come together to talk about specific issues, whether that's water, nature, energy. But the big push happened last year in Glasgow.
Well, yes, but COP27 is very important, and especially at a time like this, especially when the UN just yesterday said that the climate crisis has reached a really bleak moment and that progress has been woefully inadequate. Is it really the time to just not show up as Prime Minister?
Well, as I say, I'm not aware if, say, President Biden or Macron or any of those other people will be there. It is quite standard practice that every 5 years is the big
that's changing, isn't
gathering.
it? They're putting more emphasis on these annual meetings.
Well, there's always the annual meetings have always been important. I mean, this year in particular, we're seeing also the Convention on Nature. It's called Convention of Biodiversity, as well as one on illegal trade of endangered species. So there's a number of different things coming together. So it's an important year for the environment. But we have held the presidency for the last year, and it's important that we hand that over now to Egypt. But we will continue to do as we are doing, working towards different ways of how we meet our carbon budget domestically, but also the support that we give around the world to different countries and how we take that forward. And we certainly showed leadership last year when we really set ourselves challenging targets. And we will continue, as I say, to work with partners around the world to help them deliver their commitments too.
But what message does it send out to those partners around the world? And given that you're saying that the environment is still a priority, why then, in 48 hours as Prime Minister, has Rishi Sunak not only pulled out of COP27, but he's taken Alex Sharma out of the cabinet, and also the Climate Minister Graham Stewart is also out of the cabinet as well. Is this a failure of leadership on the climate issue? Is this no longer a priority?
Not at all. I think it is very much a priority, and the Prime Minister said that in Downing Street. Look, I've returned to DEFRA. I have had 3 years as a minister there before as the environment. We work in partnership right across government in order to deliver our carbon budgets. But as I say, the UK is actually handing over the presidency on the very first day. It's important that we allow the normal COP functions to carry on. But I want to reiterate, several senior government ministers will be attending, and it is normal practice that every 5 years is when the big, if you like, the prime ministers and heads of state tend to attend.
We understand, or reports suggested, that Liz Truss, when she was Prime Minister, advised King Charles not to attend COP27. Will he now be advised that he can go under Rishi Sunak?
I'm not aware that Liz ever advised the King of that, but I'm conscious that King Charles has always taken a very deep interest in the environment and climate change, and of course it would be up to him to decide how he chooses where to put his priorities in his reign as king.
Would you like to see him there?
I think, as I've just explained earlier, normally the big COPs tend to be every 5 years. The United Kingdom hosted that last year, where we had attendance from many members of the royal family. But in between, it tends to be more of a, I'm not going to say low-key, but not quite the same level of heads of state and prime ministers attending.
Would you like to see King Charles go to COP27?
I think it's up to him. I know that he takes an interest in this particular issue, but it's up to him.
There are reports this morning that Rishi Sunak is drawing up plans to expand the windfall tax further on energy companies. That levy stands at 25% at the moment. Will he increase it?
Well, I'm sure that he's working with his Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, to explore all the different elements in the run-up to the medium-term fiscal plan, which has been put back by a couple of weeks. I think it's important that the Prime Minister, of course he was the Chancellor beforehand, and can work together with his Chancellor to decide how best to make sure that we have that longer-term budget that will put us back on the path to a percentage debt falling as our debt falling as a percentage of GDP.
But as Environment Secretary, would you like to see that happen?
I think I'm not going to get into discussion about tax, because that really is a matter for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister.
So you've got no view then on whether or not he should expand the remit to include renewables as well?
Well, can I put it this way? Government ministers don't have personal views. This is about governments going through that. The new Prime Minister will be working with the Chancellor to decide where to best recognise the financial situation and how we address that.
Can I move on to Northern Ireland now? Because the deadline passed at midnight tonight for politicians to come together and restore power sharing in Northern Ireland. That deadline has been and gone. The government says that elections will follow. What do you think elections, though, will solve in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think it's regrettable the parties were not able to come together to form that executive. But the law was clear. We passed the legislation that this would happen. And clearly, there wasn't sufficient agreement to be able to avoid the elections. That wasn't in the hands of the government. That was in the hands of the parties representing the different communities in Northern Ireland. I hope that in the next elections will provide us, will be an opportunity for people to reconsider their approach, recognising the New Decade, New Approach agreement that was signed only a couple of years ago, and we need to make sure that we do what we can to work together to try and make that come to fruition.
But realistically, nothing's going to change, is it? The DUP are adamant they will stick to their policy of refusing to return to power sharing unless the Northern Ireland Protocol is removed. And elections are just going to be expensive, and they could make matters worse rather than better with views entrenching.
Well, the Prime Minister spoke to the Taoiseach yesterday, and clearly this is a situation of concern and regret. But I think both this administration, this government, but also the Irish government will be continuing to try and work to try and bring together that government, the formation of the executive after the elections. I met the Deputy Prime Minister, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, last week, and there is clear emphasis that both our government and the Irish government want the executive form, and we will keep up our efforts to do so.
Well, is there any chance that you could bring forward legislation that means that the elections don't have to go ahead? Will they definitely happen, do you think?
They will definitely happen.
OK. Any movement on the talks with the EU over the protocol?
Well, I know that the Prime Minister has always wanted to have a negotiated outcome. Clearly, the Prime Minister was part of the government under Boris Johnson when we brought forward the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, but it's important those talks continue as well.
I want to move on to the issue of the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, and her return to her position after 6 days of having left it. Still concerns around her breaking of the ministerial code after sharing sensitive information. Lord Blunkett has now said that security services could be reluctant to share sensitive information with the Home Secretary. Does that worry you?
I don't think that's the case. The Home Secretary recognised that she had breached the ministerial code last week, and clearly the Prime Minister has now had a chance to go through this and satisfied himself such that he reappointed Suella to be the Home Secretary. There are very serious matters happening in our country. Of course, our intelligence services and our police will continue to work with the Home Secretary, giving her the full information that she needs in order to be able to make decisions protecting safety. But of course, also her main priority right now is about the illegal migrations that are happening, the small boats crossing, and I know she'll put her full efforts into that.
And on the subject of immigration, Suella Braverman has said that she wants to get net migration to tens of thousands. Is that now an official government target?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the Prime Minister will be discussing those matters, but the key priority, my understanding, is about tackling the small boats. If I think about, we've stopped nearly 30,000 crossings just in this year, is my understanding. That's what I've been told. And recognise there are a lot of people here illegally. That's why we strengthened early in the year the law about how we want to handle those cases. But I think that partnership with France is critical. And indeed, the Prime Minister has been raised that, I think, in his discussions with the French President.
So no target on immigration?
I'm not aware there's any change to policy, but the focus, I think, is about illegal migration.
I just want to ask you a quick question about Liz Truss. You've always described as a close political ally, but you're a really good friend of hers, aren't you?
Yes.
Give us an idea of how tough this week's been for her. How's she doing? Have you spoken to her?
I have, of course, been in touch with Liz. She's a good friend. She's with her family, and I think she's enjoying a well-deserved break. And
you were very close to her politically and personally. Were you surprised then that you were given such a prominent job in Rishi Sunak's cabinet?
Well, I worked with the Prime Minister previously when I was at work in pensions, and he was in being the Chancellor. I think I'm known within government as being a person who delivers and gets on with the job. And I was delighted when he asked me to stay in the cabinet and to take on the role of DEFRA Secretary. I've spent 3 years in the department before, so I can hit the ground running. And there are many important issues to deal with there as we continue to want to try and make sure that we leave the world and indeed our country in a better state and for future generations than we inherited.
Well, Therese Coffey, thanks so much for coming in this morning. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's take a look at what is on the front pages of the morning papers now, shall we? And boosting election hopes for the Tories, the Prime Minister is level with Labour's Sir Keir Starmer as preferred leader of the country, according to a poll appearing on the front page of The Eye. The Telegraph leads on plans reportedly being drawn up by Mr Sunak to expand the windfall tax on energy firms in an effort to fill the country's fiscal black hole. The Guardian, though, has a different take, highlighting the bumper profits recorded by energy firm Shell on the day the UN finds there's no credible way to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. And the Times has word on the Prime Minister seeking a new deal with France to curb channel crossings. Now, Northern Ireland is set to have fresh elections before Christmas after a deadline passed at midnight to restore a devolved government in Stormont. So our Ireland correspondent Stephen Murphy joins me now from Belfast. And Stephen, we just heard there from Therese Coffey that elections will indeed be going ahead. What's the reaction there?
Yeah, Therese Coffey, pretty black and white there, that there will be another election, echoing, of course, the words of the boss here at the Northern Ireland office, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris, and all eyes will be on him and this building and any statement that we may see today. It could happen quite quickly. It could happen in the next few hours. He has repeatedly said that at 1 minute past midnight, that's this morning, in the early hours of this morning, he is under a legal obligation to call that election. That, of course, because 24 weeks or 6 months have gone by since the last election back in May, and the parties here have been unable to form that devolved government. We saw the dramatic action at Stormont yesterday, a last-ditch attempt to try and avoid all of this, which ended in failure because the DUP, the largest unionist party here, simply will not go back into government as long as the controversial Northern Ireland Protocol still exists. So therefore, the British government is under this obligation, a legal obligation, to call a fresh election here in Northern Ireland. And a new election will solve all of this, won't it? Well, no. People here simply cannot see how having a new election, which will cost £6.5 million in the middle of a chronic cost of living crisis, is going to plot a way forward politically. Because even if you were to assume that the result of an election just 6 months after the last one will be broadly similar, I mean, the DUP may hope that the unionist vote may be slightly less fragmented, they may do a little bit better this time around, but if the result is broadly the same, we have the same outcome after a new election. Will the DUP put aside their concerns and go back into Stormont? No, they simply will not do that. The leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, has been very clear about that. So when you talk to people here in Belfast, they simply are angry. Some of them are apathetic about the prospect of a new election. They don't really see how it is going to break the political impasse. But the British government says it has no choice and it has to call this new election. So all eyes on Chris Heaton-Harris today as he will lay out, presumably, what steps. He doesn't have to set the date for the poll today. It does have to be held within 12 weeks. But the most likely date for a new election here in Northern Ireland is a very Christmassy Thursday, December the 15th.
OK, we'll wait and see whether that gets confirmed later on. Stephen Murphy, thanks very much indeed. Do stay with us. We've got lots more coming up on the show for you this morning. As that fresh election in Northern Ireland looms, I'll be speaking to the former Irish Taoiseach John Bruton about what can be done for power sharing to return. And Labour's shadow Northern Ireland Secretary Peter Kyle will be with me after 8 o'clock. As the PM backs out of next month's COP27 summit, I'll be speaking to someone who worked at the last talks in Glasgow about what this means for our environmental goals. Eligible victims of the infected blood scandal and their families will receive payments of up to £100,000 today from the government. But some bereaved families will receive nothing. The government says these are interim payments and broader eligibility will be considered after the inquiry. Well, Sabah Chowdhury has been speaking to some victims and has this report.
Only memories remain. Ron Ellis died in 1987. But the impact of his death lives on through his son, Mark, who kept his father's HIV a secret for decades. The perceived shame cost him his health, relationships and career. But today, unlike others, Mark won't be compensated.
Should have been paid 30 years ago. 30 years too late.
Ron was one of thousands accidentally infected with HIV or hepatitis C through contaminated blood products between the 70s and 80s. And now, by the end of today, eligible families should have up to £100,000 in their bank accounts. Currently, only living victims or partners are eligible.
I'm glad the infected are getting it, but I believe that they could have gone further and they could have paid more. Obviously, the way I put it is the dead, they paid the ultimate price.
This is why Steve has what he calls survivor's guilt. He's been emailed saying he will be compensated for his ordeal, but some of his friends won't.
They've been, thrown under the bus and forgotten about. This is decades that we're talking about here. So any 6-figure, 7-figure compensation, divide it by the number of decades and the number of years, and it'll give you an idea of, well, that's not actually that much.
To campaigners, compensation is a start, but it's also bittersweet.
We've got a long way to go. Okay. The inquiry will conclude its hearings in early part of 2023. People are dying every single week and not knowing whether they're going to be included in the compensation. And it's not just about money, it's about acknowledgement of what happened.
That's all Mark wants, admission. Money, of course, helps, but it won't bring back his father. It will, however, be one step closer to justice. Sabah Chowdhury, Sky News, Swindon.
China's Deputy Ambassador in London has warned the UK against protecting Hong Kong protesters after a man was beaten up at the country's consulate in Manchester earlier on this month.
Protecting shelter to the Hong Kong independent elements will only, in the end, bring disaster to Britain. I remind you of a story of the farmer and the snake in Aesop's tales, where the farmer showed sympathy to the snake, but finally bit by the snake.
Well, Sky's Milena Veselinovic joins me now from outside the Chinese embassy in London. And how does this develop the story, this statement, this warning here, Milena?
Well, it's a veiled but perhaps not so subtle message to Britain that if it acts decisively over that incident at the Chinese consulate in Manchester. It risks compromising trade links between Britain and China. The charge d'affaires there, you heard him talk about how it might end up being disastrous for Britain to, in his words, shelter the independent Hong Kong elements. He also went on to talk about the importance of China-Britain trade links, saying that China was Britain's third largest trading partner, number one source of imports, and he also said that there were elements trying to cause a confrontation between the two countries, which he said could be dangerous and bad for both sides. Now, he addressed that particular incident in Manchester, saying that China had made solemn representations, as he said, to the UK government, urging Britain to judge the case on its merits and not to, as he said, bow to political pressure. Now, the government of Liz Truss has said that they would wait for the outcome of the police investigation to conclude before deciding what to do with the staff involved. Rishi Sunak, who has only been the PM since this Tuesday, has not commented on this case yet, but there is a number of MPs, both Labour and Conservatives, who are calling on the Chinese staff in that consulate in Manchester to be expelled over this.
Milena, thanks very much indeed. Let's take a look now at some of the day's other headlines. And one person has been killed and 6 injured during a stabbing spree at a supermarket in the Italian city of Milan. One of those hurt is Arsenal footballer Pablo Mari, who's on loan to the Italian Serie A club Monza. The motive for the attack is unknown, but police say a 46-year-old man who's been arrested had shown signs of psychological illness. Amazon shares have dropped nearly 20% after the online retail giant's forecast about its all-important holiday shopping period. The company says it expects a slowdown in sales growth due to high inflation and tighter household budgets. New research shows nurses are working the equivalent of 1 day a week for free. A study by London Economics found the salary of experienced nurses has fallen by 20% since 2010. The report claims that rising wages may save the NHS money in the long run because of the high cost of bringing in foreign workers. British Transport Police have put out an image of a suspect they believe assaulted a man at a London tube station, then pushed another onto the tracks. The incidents happened yesterday at Baker Street Station and Finchley Road Station. Just Stop Oil protesters have targeted another famous work of art, The Girl with a Pearl Earring. Video shared online shows one protester trying to glue his head to the painting that you can see there, which is on display in The Hague. Another appears to pour a can of tomatoes over him. The artwork wasn't damaged, but we understand that 3 people were arrested after that. Now, scientists are examining 2 meteorite impacts on Mars with the aim of understanding more about how the red planet was formed. Amazing pictures. NASA's InSight lander is examining the site where 2 space rocks crashed into the Martian surface, each creating large craters. And the lander detected seismic waves from the meteor strikes, which happened last year. The reverberation of those waves along the surface is giving scientists insight into the structure of the planet's crust, which may hold clues about the origin and the evolution of Mars. Now for something that's thankfully not seen every day in Los Angeles. A mountain lion was spotted on the loose, forcing residents and a nearby school to lock their doors and stay inside. Could be a bit alarmed seeing that out of my window. The animal managed to evade wildlife officers for hours before they were finally able to tranquilise and capture it. And they later released the cougar back into the wild. Quite a big cat to have in your back garden. A reminder of our top stories now here this morning. And Elon Musk has completed his $44 billion takeover of Twitter and immediately sacked several senior executives from the company. Snap election in Northern Ireland is expected within weeks after the deadline to restore the devolved government expired at midnight. And the Prime Minister has been accused of a failure of leadership for deciding to not attend the COP27 climate summit. And with more on that, the Environment Secretary has defended the Prime Minister's decision not to attend, saying heads of state normally only attend every 5 years. Therese Coffey also told the programme it would be up to King Charles whether he decides to go.
I'm not aware that Liz ever advised the King of that, but I'm conscious that King Charles has always taken a very deep interest in the environment and climate change, and of course it would be up to him to decide how he chooses where to put his priorities in his reign as king.
Would you like to see King Charles go to COP27?
I think it's up to him. I know that he takes an interest in this particular issue, but it's up to him.
Well, our political correspondent Ali Fortescue is here with me this morning. Very good morning to you. And so Therese Coffey there really playing down this decision by Rishi Sunak not to go to COP27, says that the government is still very committed to environmental policies.
Yeah, she says that he has shown leadership. I think the problem is he said he's not going to COP27. We know that Alok Sharma, who's was the president of COP26, is now not attending cabinet. We know that Graham Stewart, a climate minister, is not attending cabinet. So I think when you take all those things in the round, there have been accusations, certainly from Labour, that is this still a government priority. Of course, their defence will be that on the 17th of November there is this big budget, this moment that the government want to set out how they are going to help to fill that spending, that funding gap, what that's going to mean, painful decisions potentially ahead. So the Prime Minister saying, he's very much focused on domestic issues. We heard Therese Coffey there defending him, saying he is showing leadership on climate change and saying that actually usually every 5 years is when we have these big summits. But the reality is the climate problem is obviously not getting any better. We had these warnings yesterday from the UN that there is no credible pathway to keeping 1.5 alive. So there is pressure on him. Will we perhaps now see the King going? We don't know. The government making clear they don't want to get involved in that. Previously, under Liz Truss, it seemed like he wasn't going. Maybe that could change and take some of the heat off Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting, won't it? And I'm sure Labour will have a word to say or two as well about COP27.
Yes.
It'll be interesting to see what they say. Ali, for the moment, thanks very much indeed. Now, Northern Ireland is set to have a fresh election this year after the deadline to restore a devolved government in Stormont passed. The DUP has blocked the restoration of the crucial power-sharing agreement because of disagreements about the post-Brexit trade deal. Well, let's get a view on this now from John Bruton, who's the former Prime Minister of Ireland and former Ambassador of the European Union to the United States. John Bruton, a very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us. What do you make of the failure to restore power sharing in Northern Ireland? The deadline missed at midnight.
Well, basically, they ran out of time and this decision was thereby inevitable. The problem is that there hasn't been a negotiation of a serious character going on for several months now between the UK government and the European Union on the protocol. Now, I understand the EU is prepared to make substantial concessions in the direction of what the UK wants, reducing the number of checks by up to 90%, reducing the amount of forms to be filled. I gather the form has gone from 30 pages down to 3 pages that need to be filled. So the EU is working hard on painting a picture for the UK as to what could be achieved if they would enter into serious negotiation. The difficulty is that as long as the UK is talking about negotiation, but also threatening to abrogate the entire protocol and introduce retained EU law that would abolish all EU standards in the UK, whether they've been examined or not, by the end of 2023. That creates an atmosphere of instability, which makes negotiation more difficult. So I think we need to use the time away from the election campaign to reinitiate negotiations of a serious character between the UK and the European Union Commission.
In the meantime, though, elections will be triggered. Do you think that can achieve something?
Not particularly, but it's part of what is provided for in the agreement. And obviously, to have postponed the election would, I think, have diminished the credibility of the Secretary of State. He needed to make sure that people understood that if he says something is going to happen, it will happen, and that enhances his credibility. So this is a process we've got to go through. I don't expect the result will make much difference. Perhaps the DUP position may be slightly strengthened vis-a-vis the traditional unionist voice, which may give them a little bit more room for manoeuvre, but it won't be substantial. The big thing is to get a negotiation, which has to be very complex negotiation, because obviously the parties in Northern Ireland have to be involved, the UK government has to be involved, the European Commission has to be involved, but so also the Irish government and the governments of the other member states of the European Union, who have an interest in protecting the integrity of the single market, and Ireland as part of the single market, which has been a huge economic benefit for Ireland being in the single market. All those interests have to be conciliated, and we've got to reach an agreement as to timing so that everybody makes their concessions at the same time, and that we all are able to, if you like, jump at the same time towards an agreement. And that is an immensely complex exercise of both substance and timing.
Well, yes. And do you feel that movement, though, is heading in the right direction? You talk about some of the onus being on the UK government in its role in negotiations. We've seen some shifting in position, haven't we? Steve Baker, Northern Ireland Minister, apologised to the EU and the Irish government for the attitude taken by him and some others in the Conservative Party. Do gestures like that make a difference?
Oh, absolutely. I think that was a very, very good and a brave thing for him to have done. I think it's important to get the tone right, but it's also important to get the substance right. And there is obviously a big difficulty if essentially the UK's unilateral protocol abolition bill, if that's being processed vigorously, and if the retained EU law bill is being processed vigorously, that makes negotiation much more difficult. So we've got to find a pause, so to speak, during which negotiation can take place. And that pause probably will have to wait until after the Stormont election is over, and then a period of intense effort on all sides, time-bound, to find a solution that's reasonable for everybody. And nobody is going to get all they want. Everybody's going to have to give some ground. The EU will have to give some ground, and it has already indicated what it might give. The UK, the Northern Ireland parties, and the Irish government will all have to accept somewhat less than they would like in their ideal world.
You mentioned that the protocol abolition bill, you think that is problematic while the UK government negotiates with the EU, but some might argue that it gives the British government leverage in those talks. It shows that the government means business, and it strengthens their negotiating stance.
I think that notion of leverage in a negotiation that's supposed to be based on mutual trust is almost contradictory. It suggests bad faith or distrust. And I think the UK should at least approach the negotiations with the European Commission initially on the basis of good faith and accepting the good faith of the people on the other side, and using off-stage threats like the protocol bill as a lever is not good from the point of view of creating the right atmosphere for negotiation. Remember, what this bill is doing is attempting unilaterally to abrogate a solemn international treaty. And that's something that Britain has not been inclined to do. Indeed, over the 19th and 20th centuries, Britain was the greatest champion of the integrity of international treaties, and very hard on countries that broke international treaty obligations. Britain should, I think, apply that principle to itself.
So we look like we're on track for another set of elections in Northern Ireland, the second this year. I mean, can that be justified? I mean, the cost is being put at £6.5 million. I mean, this is a cost of living crisis that's going on at the moment. Is it really necessary?
It is necessary under the agreement. That's the agreement we reached, and that's what the law says. And I don't think we should be putting a price on elections. Elections are a necessary process for consulting people. And there are problems in Northern Ireland. There are deep divisions. The majority of people in Northern Ireland want to go ahead with an executive. One major party, the DUP, which is a minority party, but a big minority, says it will not go ahead unless there are adjustments to the protocol. that needs to be discussed. And there's probably no better atmosphere in which to discuss the options and to test public opinion than an election campaign. I think elections are a crucial part of democracy. They're not the full expression of democracy, but they're a crucial part of it. I don't see any problem there. And I don't think we should ever be putting a price tag on elections.
OK, well, John Bruton, former Taoiseach, we really appreciate your time and your thoughts today. Thanks very much indeed. The production of the first coins featuring King Charles's portrait has started at the Royal Mint. The new 50p coin, which honours the new monarch's late mother, the Queen, will go into circulation before the end of the year. Sky's Becky Cottrell went to the Royal Mint for a sneak preview.
History in the making, quite literally. These are the first coins featuring King Charles III. And these 50p pieces also pay a special tribute to his mother. The reverse is a replica of the coin produced to celebrate her coronation back in 1953.
So anyone under 50 will only have ever seen Queen Elizabeth II on their coin. So significant moment today where we're putting a new monarch into that circulation. So it's quite common for male monarchs not to wear a crown on their coinage. It happened to his father, his grandfather. When they were on coinage, there was no crown.
If you're particularly observant, you'll notice that His Majesty is facing the opposite direction to Queen Elizabeth II on the coins that we currently use. That is in keeping with tradition when there's a new monarch. The portrait was designed by sculptor Martin Jennings using photos and was personally approved by the King.
It has to be an image that will persist over the years and that will represent the generality of what people imagine monarchy to be about. So it's not just a portrait of him, it needs to contain the role.
We'll still have coins with the effigy of Queen Elizabeth II. They'll only be replaced once they're worn or damaged. But you won't have to wait long for these, which could start appearing in your change in December. Becky Cottrell, Sky News, the Royal Mint.
As we've been reporting this morning, eligible victims of the infected blood scandal and their families will receive payments of up to £100,000 today from the government. But some bereaved families will receive nothing. Well, I'm joined now by Michelle Tolley, who was infected with a life-threatening disease when she had a blood transfusion in the 1980s. So, Michelle Tolley, thanks so much for talking to us this morning. We really appreciate it. Tell us a little bit more about your experience and what happened to you.
OK, well, I received a blood transfusion in 1987 after the birth of our first son. Unfortunately, in that blood transfusion was hepatitis C. That was in 1987. I wasn't diagnosed until the end of 2015. So I've campaigned since I've been infected to reach out to find those people that are still infected out there and that to help call on for this inquiry that's now sort of coming to a close.
Well, yes, and tell us a little bit about you. Will you receive compensation yourself? Are you eligible under this scheme?
Yes, I'm one of the beneficiaries that are eligible. There are only two sets of beneficiaries eligible at the moment. That's for the people infected like myself and for the bereaved partners, widows, widowers and partners of the people that have tragically died and lost their lives to this horrific injustice that's happened to us all. I'd like to say that this is only an interim compensation payment and we're waiting for Sir Brian Langstaff's full report that we're looking forward to, that it will be coming in next summer. In that, we want included the people, the cohorts of people that are not included this time round. So people that was infected post-1991. There are people out there that still receive contaminated blood that are not aware of that. People that lost, sadly and tragically lost their children to hepatitis C, HIV and other pathogens. For the children that lost their parents, there's people who self-cleared hepatitis C that are not entitled to anything, although they was infected by the contaminated blood. And there's the people whose medical records that we destroyed, and as we've been hearing over the time from the inquiry, that have accidentally gone missing. So there are lots and lots of people today that will not be receiving that money. But I, for one, and I know a lot of our fellow campaigners, whether we've received this interim compensation or not, we will not stop fighting and campaigning until everybody is included in these schemes, because basically this should never have happened. You know, we should never have been given a death sentence for committing no crimes.
And the government does say that the interim compensation payments, they say that they meet the recommendations set out by Sir Brian Langstaff's interim report in full, but there is more work to be done. They're looking at broader eligibility recommendations made by Sir Robert Francis QC. Do you accept that the right kind of work is being done to make sure that everybody who should be compensated is?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're working hard now on submissions, ready to go in, ready, for Sir Brian to write his report. So there's still a lot of work to be done. This is the first stage. For me, it shows finally that the government are beginning to realise what a historic tragedy has happened, and why thousands of people that have died have never received a penny. It's so wrong. But I always try to leave things on a positive. It's a positive step forward from the government to call it interim compensation. You know, at the end of the day, they've got a duty of care. They need to look after their people that were contaminated. People's lives were damaged, lives lost. Those lives, no amount of money can bring those lives lost. £100,000 might sound a lot of money, but for me, when you divide that by my 35 years and contamination, it really is pennies. It really is. It's just nothing. Sorry.
No, I was only going to say, I know that you're so keen to make sure that everybody else receives compensation like you, and that's your main message today. But I am interested to hear what it means to you to receive a payment after, as you say, 35 years of having been infected as you have.
Do you know, at this moment in time, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't really feel anything. It's been a long fight, and although I've only been in this for 7 years, you know, there's campaigners that have been doing this for 30 years plus, and I really take my hat off and thank them for putting the hard work in at the beginning. I don't know how I feel about it. I don't know. It can't bring back. It will never reverse the damage to my body that's been caused. So it's a bit surreal. It's something that was definitely never going to happen. It's been an inquiry, you know, we've campaigned so hard. People have died while they're campaigning. One person is still dying every 96 hours. You know, that hasn't stopped. So will I be around by the end when the final compensation comes? Who knows? I've been left with liver cirrhosis, so I'm a potential candidate to get liver
Michelle,
cancer.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. So good to hear from you, but we're just about to fall off air, so I have to wrap it up. Michelle Tolley, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.